Okay. I'm sorry.
Did he step away for just a minute?
Yeah, should be back in a second now.
Mike's looking good. Eddie's doing outside.
Okay. I think we're all there. I think we're all set. Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thanks very much. It was this one. Operatim? Operatim? Oh, there he is.
I have the second undergraduate paper assignment.
So the second undergraduate paper assignment is with Operatim for the college students.
There'll be some up in the front also.
Okay, I'm going to start today with 25 minutes of an overview connecting some of our discussions from the previous weeks with what we're talking about today in terms of the future of innovation and the knowledge economy. Just to start out with some of the key questions that we have been grappling with. About where we're heading with technology and innovation. And we've already had a kind of an introduction to some of the key issues, the debate between the techno-optimists and the techno-pessimists, and in light of the existing rapid pace of innovation in a number of very different areas, broadly that we call here the knowledge economy here, but everything from robotics to biotech to new digital technologies. And the optimists tend to believe that these innovations will eventually disseminate and encompass broad segments of the economy, and with sufficient investment in skills in the workforce, have the potential of bringing vast majority of the working people up. The pessimists essentially are coming in two variants. One who do not necessarily believe that the scope of the technological change today, the content of the new knowledge economy is such that it can possibly encompass much of the economy, large parts of the economy, that it will inherently remain much more limited in its impact compared to the past industrial revolutions, the role that the electricity played, or the first industrial revolution, or the internal combustion engine. And the second strand of techno-pessimists being those who worry about the implications for inequality and for labor markets, that while they're willing to, while they would grant that the implications of these new technologies are potentially quite significant, that they could be transformative, that because of a number of structural features of these new technologies and the nature of the labor force and the way that market economies operate, that the benefits will accrue mostly to narrow segments of the workforce, that in particular large segments of the middle of the workforce will become excluded from this process. There's a developing country version of this debate that plays out once again that around the axis of the possibilities of dissemination and what it does to production and employment in the developing countries. On the one hand, these new technologies might allow, through a process of diffusion, developing countries to leapfrog some of the development process by taking on these these new technologies, and there are ways in which these new technologies are making, for example, services more tradable, and therefore now developing countries might be able to export services and not just manufacturing, and therefore able to take advantage of world markets and these new technologies much more rapidly. On the other hand, the concern that precisely because these new technologies make significant demands on institutions, on regulations, and on human capital, on skills. And since these are the things that are the hardest to obtain in developing countries are poor precisely because they lack the skills, the institutions, the high-quality regulatory environments, that these new technologies leave developing countries in aggregate in terms of in a much more difficult position to catch up because the gap between what is required and what developing countries have is becoming much wider with these new technologies. So in terms of the current evidence, and again, bits and pieces of this we've talked about, there are two sort of strands of evidence that seem to line up so far more with the pessimists than the optimists. In the context of the advanced countries, we've talked before that in fact, despite all this amazing innovation around us, that the actual pace of productivity growth has slowed down for a couple of decades at least in the advanced countries. And not only that, that the gap between the most innovative, the most productive firms and the rest, the lagging firms, is growing wider. So one picture here shows the slowing down of the growth rate of productivity. This is labor productivity in the United States. The second picture shows the gap that has opened up, not just in the United States, but in all the leading advanced countries, not the developing world, the advanced countries. The gap that's opened up in terms of productivity performance between the frontier firms, the firms that are doing really well, doing innovating, where productivity is growing rapidly, and the rest. And that's true both in manufacturing and in services. Another dimension of this problem of dissemination, the problem of divergence, or the problem of growing difference, or the dualization of the economies of the advanced countries, is what we see when we look at not across firms, the better performing firms and the lagging firms, but we look across space. That if we look at metropolitan regions that are on the frontier of these new technologies, they're doing much better, and the gap between them and the rest of the country is growing wider. And that's very different, for example, from the experience that the United States had up until the 1980s, when in fact the lagging regions were catching up with the frontier. So if you looked at measures of incomes, of labor productivity, the South, for example, was catching up with the North. The process since then has essentially been reversed in terms of productivity, job creation, and ability to employ new employment. A few metropolitan areas such as Boston, San Jose, San Diego are doing much, much better, and the rest is being left behind. From the perspective of the workers, an even worse outcome that's sort of magnifying some of these problems is that taking the path of productivity as given, the share of productivity gains that shows up in increased earnings, increased wages, increased payments to actual workers is also going down. So there's been a kind of ever since the 1980s, a gap also has been opened up between the overall productivity, profitability of firms and the payments to production or non-supervisory workers. So this is leaving out the management and leaving out owners of capital, but looking at production workers and non-supervisory workers, their earnings have fallen far behind a rate of productivity growth, which in fact has also fallen fallen down as I've indicated. So in the context of the advanced countries, we have the problem of the slowing down of productivity growth, a decline in the dissemination of innovation from frontier firms to others in the same economy, a spatial segregation in terms of what parts of the countries are doing well and what parts are doing worse, and a growing inability of relatively less skilled or medium skilled workers, production workers, non-supervisor workers, of reaping the benefits of the productivity as it exists. The counterpart of many of these trends in the developing countries show up in a process that we can call a process of premature deindustrialization, that developing countries, low and middle income countries, are now beginning to deindustrialize much earlier than has been traditionally the case during the process of economic development. And this is intimately tied with the process of dissemination of technology globally. What is happening is that this technology is disseminating globally through global value chains, through foreign investment, through international trade, but the firms and the professionals who are part of this networks of dissemination and catching up are becoming a smaller and smaller part of the low and middle income countries' economies. And the manufacturing or industrialization, which was a traditional escalator, which once you put your workers in there from informal activities from the countryside, regular farmers would become more productive. Workers in a factory would become the foundation of a middle class. That escalator has becoming narrower and narrower, and also flatter and flatter, which is that it doesn't rise all that much anymore. So taken together, these are they create the instigation or the motivation for the issues that we talk about in this course. There's a linked problem of, on the one hand, prosperity, on the other hand, of inclusion and inequality. That is to say that on the one hand, we don't seem to be reaping the benefits of productivity and the knowledge economy. On the other hand, we have this growing productive and spatial inequality and problems of economic insecurity, which in turn are linked, I think, to the social and political problems of our time. In order to see how we can make progress in a kind of a future-oriented agenda to these problems, we need to unpack the notion of innovation and technology and the knowledge economy, so we can understand what are the points of intervention. Okay? So that's what I'm going to be doing in the rest of my comments, and then we'll continue our discussion. So innovation or technology is really about asking which questions are being asked and whose problems or what problems are being solved, right? That's what new knowledge, that's what innovation, that's what technology does. What questions are we going to ask, and whose problems are going to be solved? If we think about technology innovation in that way, we immediately see that those are parts of sort of what collective choice in society is about determining the answers to these questions, and that technology is not something that's purely exogenous or drops from the sky. The simple economics of innovation is straightforward, that the usual problem is that the cost of coming up with new ideas, research and development tends to be private. You need to invest your time, your resources in your lab, hire people. But the benefits of new ideas or new technologies are social. That is to say, once you've invented a new idea, in principle, it's costless to disseminate it. Everybody can share in the benefits of that new idea or a new process or a new product. And those ideas provide, therefore, social benefits. So the cost of innovation tend to be private. The benefits tend to accrue to society as a whole, which is why technology or ideas or innovation is so different, fundamentally different than the kinds of thing that we think is usually the domain of private markets. It's very different from producing a car, or producing steel, or producing potato chips, where you bear both the private costs and the benefits you can appropriate because you get the rewards by selling it appropriately. The idea that market failure is intrinsic to innovation is reflected in the fact that in all societies, support for innovation, support for new ideas is ubiquitous. We see it in a number of different domains. All of these are policies that exist all around the world, subsidizing research and development spending, providing intellectual property rights or patent protection. You come up with a new idea, a new product or process, you have temporary monopoly, so you can keep those rents for a while. It's a way to make some of the social benefits, privatize them for a while. Programs of co-financing, credit subsidies, loan guarantees to innovators, provision of seed funding for new ventures, cluster development policies, we'll talk about those later, or moonshot missions, that is the kinds of things that are covered in your reading by Mariano Mazzucato for this week, which is sort of particular missions around which the state or the government organizes itself to achieve the consequences. So the priorities that agencies of the state or the government adopts shape these support policies. Sometimes those priorities are explicit, sometimes they're implicit, but even when they're implicit, they skew the direction in which new ideas develop. They skew the direction in which the actual innovators choose the kinds of questions that they're going to answer, and therefore also whose problems or what problems end up being solved. Just quick examples from some US federal programs to make this a little bit more concrete about the kinds of things that the United States government does. We've often referred to DARPA. It's an agency that goes back to the 1950s, where the United States essentially took it as a public mission to fund new technologies that are defense related. This is a fairly large program. It's a $3.5 billion program. And what's innovative and new about this program is that actually it runs very differently from what a government program or government bureaucracy does, because it's run by program managers. People are called program managers who are actually hired from the private sector. They might be engineers, they might be business people. They're hired for 3 to 5 people, and they're pretty much autonomous in developing their own program of trying to generate from the ground new technologies. And the way they do it is by essentially setting a set of goals and then tracking progress around the goals. And DARPA has been the instigator of many of the key technologies of our era, probably the internet and the GPS among them being sort of some of the best known. A later effort, an analog in the energy area is the ARPA-E, run out of the Department of Energy, Advanced Research Projects Agency Energy, and that was founded in 2009. It has a much smaller budget, and you might be interested to know that President Trump's current proposal for the budget actually closes down this agency. There's a set of manufacturing institutes that was also set up under the Obama administration. These manufacturing institutes are actually interesting because they are the kind of a model of engaging in productive development policy or industrial policy that we'll come back to also later. We might talk about it later in this session, which is that they're sort of partnerships, and in a way also mirror in some ways the DARPA model, that there are sort of partnerships among, on the one hand, the government that provides some seed funding, that provides the coordination, and then industry and academia as well. And these institutes, there are, I think, well, how many of them? There is about a dozen of them, I believe. No, actually, there are, I think, 14 of them right now. And each one of them focuses on a different area, such as digital manufacturing or advanced fabrics, robotics, and so forth. And they try to set up clusters and catalyze advanced manufacturing technologies. So each one of these have a particular sort of purpose they've built in. They revolve around a set of key objectives. And one question we might ask is, what kind of objectives do we actually ask of a kind of an effort along these lines in the current era, whether these kinds of efforts are adequate, whether the models that they present are useful ones, and do we apply them to new areas, for example, generating much more inclusive employment and focusing much more on dissemination, perhaps, rather than getting new technologies off the ground. Obviously, firms prefer innovations that would maximize their returns. So they would tend to focus on innovations that do not diffuse easily, that they can actually monopolize. Technologies that have the property, they would raise entry barriers against potential competitors. Technologies that might enhance control over workers, because this way they can actually monitor what they are doing and better operate. They can adjust their operations and production schedules. And they obviously prefer technologies where they can shift the costs and risks onto others. And firms are unlikely to undertake innovations that provide very large social value if the private benefits are relatively meager. Of course, environmental technologies are a key area. Now, one area of discussion and research in recent years has been the question of to what extent, in fact, despite such problems, firms might be persuaded to adopt what some people call high road strategies, strategies that advance and use technology to the benefit of their workers and their stakeholders and the broader community, rather than simply for the bottom line or for profitability. And might there be, in fact, coincidence that some of those technologies and using technologies that, for example, make workers happier and improve them, might it also reflect positively in the bottom line, so that these high road strategies are self-sustaining, that you don't actually need necessarily the government to go in there and do something or force them to do something, because these are things that are in the interest of the firms themselves. And there's a number of, by now, fairly large number of sort of informal or formal case studies that have looked at instances where, in fact, firms can benefit for investing in the kinds of technology, in the kind of practices that are directly friendly to their workers. And the theory of the case here is that satisfied workers are better workers on account of two things. One is that they're much more likely to be productive. The second, they're much more likely to stay rather than leave. And both of those things are directly positive things for the bottom line, productivity for obvious reasons, and fewer quits because turnover costs are a very large and costly item for many firms. So by reducing turnover costs, by having fewer people quit, you can actually raise profits. But without necessarily completely overlooking the possibility that in a number of domains such high road strategies can be sustainable. I also think that we shouldn't think necessarily that such private sector incentives are universal or that they're going to be sufficiently strong. I think even in the best of circumstances, when firms might have the incentive to look after their own workers, or maybe their immediate communities, there are two sorts of additional externalities or market failures that would require a collective action or public action. One is the type of what I would call good jobs externalities, that when firms provide good jobs, they benefit not only those workers directly, but they benefit the broader community at large. Firms that are simply looking for the well-being of their own workers are not necessarily going to take into account those those social effects. In fact, the workers themselves might not take into account all those broader effects as well, as long as they are protected by these practices, but there are broader social consequences. The second thing have to do with sort of maintaining highly productive ecosystems or clusters that those often have present the nature of a kind of coordination, and that kind of coordination failure cannot be left up to individual firms to solve, so that there are coordination failures that prevent the emergence of productive ecosystems in the way that firms relate to other firms or to their suppliers, that an individual firm is not going to necessarily have the adequate incentives to invest in the kinds of technologies if those relationships can change over time, and therefore firms or suppliers who are the beneficiary of these investments can take them somewhere else. The questions about who gets to innovate, how quickly does innovation diffuse, how is innovation deployed, and what kind of workers does it help or replace, I think all of these provide sort of plausible points of intervention for us to think about what is the right set of social, political, and economic institutions that affects the answers to these questions. On who gets to innovate, its fundamental question is, how do we equip people to innovate? Do we give them the right kind of education? Do we give them access to credit and to finance? Are they able to take the risks that is required for innovation? Are the safety nets in place for people to be willing to take those risks? Do we provide an adequate environment for these productive ecosystems and clusters and networks to arise? All those decisions that we make on those domains are going to affect who in fact gets to be an innovator, whether it's going to be only certain firms, or whether we're going to also think about smaller firms, medium-sized firms, also thinking of themselves as innovators. The question about the diffusion of innovation, obviously here there's a whole set of regulations and a legal context which plays a key role in terms of the terms of patents, how strictly and stringently are competition policies, antitrust policies enforced, whether there are licensing or technology transfer requirements in certain areas for the benefit of the public at large, as opposed to simply presuming that technologies, whether they're protected by patents or not, are the property of the innovator. On the question of how is innovation deployed, this is a question that we were getting into in our discussion last week with Professor Bankler as well. Who gets to use these new technologies and to what end? So there's an ongoing debate. Some of you may have seen the article on Google in the New York Times just recently, where the workers are having a serious disagreement with the management about what kind of new technology should Google be developing. Is it okay for Google to take on contracts with immigration control authorities or with national security agencies? And many workers feel that Google should not be engaged in developing new technologies to those ends. Or an ongoing discussion and debate in the context of Amazon, the way that some of these new technologies are deployed in Amazon vis-a-vis its own workforce. That is the use of these scanner guns that keep track exactly of what worker is doing every second and whether a worker is shelving or stocking sufficiently rapidly, with sort of real-time feedback being given not just to the worker but to also his or her supervisor about whether this act is being done sufficiently rapidly or not, and sort of with warning signals if the worker is falling behind the expected norm. And this is a kind of technology that is sort of being deployed to increase the control of the firm over its workforce. You could also imagine much the same technology instead being employed by workers to improve the kind of flexibility and autonomy they have in the job. It would be a very different kind of deployment of very similar kinds of technology. Here, of course, we have sort of questions about the nature of the firm, corporate governance and labor relations, and how questions about who runs the firm, the extent to which labor has a voice, and what's the purpose of a firm. Questions about corporate governance become critical in terms of how innovation is being deployed. And finally, the factor bias or the factor intensity of these new technologies. What kind of workers do these technologies help or replace? You've heard the term skill bias technological change. A lot of these new technologies are complementary to skills and are designed to replace relatively less skilled workers. Here we have a number of policies or institutional contexts that push us in that direction. Some of that has been discussed in your readings. So for example, when we tax labor and subsidize capital, what we are effectively doing is sending a signal to investors and to innovators that the direction in which they ought to be innovating is to economize on the relatively expensive factor, that's labor, and to automate. And therefore, you have a tendency to invest a lot in robots that are going to replace expensive workers. But of course, those are jobs that not only provide livelihood, but also provide identity and meaning to people in their private and social lives. Even going beyond these kinds of tax incentives or price incentives that exist in our fiscal code, the kind of frame of mind that exists in Silicon Valley, or even not, you go to the School of Engineering here or to MIT, a kind of norms that are internalized that has to do with sort of a particular type of innovation, saving on labor. Now, there's a real question here which we might discuss with Roberto. That is the question. Sort of ultimately, of course, it would be great if we could all do cognitive labor, and that sort of the drudgery of sort of more low or middle skill labor was replaced by machines. So in some sense, in a kind of world where we're all able to do kind of cognitive labor, we might all be better off. But there is a real question of transition and timing about, in fact, how quickly we can move there, and is it possible to achieve that move without significantly affecting the middle of our income distribution and the middle of the employment distribution in this country. Okay? So I've talked about many of these kinds of particular types of policies. We can come back to them later, and I'm sure we'll discuss more of them in the course. Just to conclude, I think the key takeaways is that even though we talk about markets for technology and innovation, and we move seamlessly back and forth between a market system, a free market system, and innovation, and often you hear the arguments that governments should stay away from innovation, that governments cannot direct economic activity, that governments cannot pick winners. In fact, markets for innovation are inherently imperfect. Governments are and have been inextricably linked to innovation. So the question really isn't whether the government should be involved in an innovation, but the question is what the purpose and what's the specific arrangements that relationship should take, and sort of what should be a much more explicitly self-conscious view of government's involvement in the direction and dissemination and deployment of new technologies. And finally, the point that even though we have a wide range of interventions currently on the part of the government, that there is a big gap between what the government actually does and in terms of fostering specific types of technologies, whether it is sort of robotics or whether it is defense-related technologies, and the kinds of technologies that I think society at large would benefit from, and the kind of technologies that might in fact be much more conducive to an inclusive technological development, that consciousness is not yet reflected in national technological policies. I would say that probably the one area where this is changing would be probably sort of the green technologies and new technologies with respect to energy, because of the obvious and immediate challenge of climate change. But there's, I would say, there's kind of a almost equivalent, perhaps not so dramatic, challenge with respect to inclusion and equality and fairness, which requires, I think, thinking of the direction of technological change in exactly kind of similar terms, and that is not yet reflected, I don't think, in government policy in this area.
So we are dealing here with one of the major foreground themes of the course in the context of the background theme of the course. The foreground theme that we are addressing is the nature and the alternative futures of the knowledge economy. Now, I have to insist, and it is not a minor quibble, that we should not understand the knowledge economy as simply a set of technologies. It is, above all, a set of practices associated with a potential that in its present confined form is largely suppressed. At the level of the organization of production, or of the so-called technical division of labor, its characteristic practices reconcile production at scale with the destandardization or customization of goods and services. Destandardization characterized craft production, and standardized production at scale characterized industrial mass production. Now these attributes are recombined. And the second technical characteristic is to combine the reconciliation of coherence and momentum in the process of production with a great expansion of decentralized initiative by the worker and especially by the work teams. But what is most important about the knowledge economy is its potential, a potential that it reveals only very imperfectly in its present quarantine situation. First, the potential to relax or even reverse what has been the most constant constraint in economic life, diminishing marginal returns. Commit an input, the returns to the input rise, plateau, and fall. And now there's the promise that this constraint could be relaxed or even overturned to the extent that the process of innovation becomes perpetual rather than episodic, and internal rather than external to the process of production. The second feature of this suppressed potential is the promise of a revolution in the moral culture of production that traditional production, industrial mass production, conventional industry, is based on a modicum of trust, a low trust generalized among strangers and combined with command and control practices. Now we have a relaxation of command and control and a heightening of the level of reciprocal trust and of discretionary initiative allowed and demanded of all participants in production. And the third characteristic is that the activity of producing comes to resemble more closely the activity of discovering. The best firms become like the best schools, and thus there is at least the possibility of a momentous change in the relation between the worker and the machine. Everything that we've learned how to repeat, we inscribe in the machine, and the point of the machine is then to reserve our supreme resource, our time, for what we have not yet learned how to repeat. The combination of the machine and the anti-machine, the human being, becomes immensely more powerful than either of them alone. Now, the background theme that we are addressing is the way to think about socially inclusive economic growth and its construction. The most widely professed political economic goal in the world, and now it seems to be robbed from us. And the way to think about it is much more important than any particular list of technical initiatives. Because once we have the way to think, we can develop over time whatever technical initiatives we need. Now, against that background of these two themes, the foreground theme and the underlying theme, I want to approach our problem today as the reckoning with a disappointment. And this is how I interpret Danny's PowerPoint. The disappointment is that we have this remarkable burst of scientific and technological development and new practices, promising exponential growth to the broad benefit of society. And instead, we have stagnation and inequality, a slowdown in the rise of productivity, and an aggravation of inequality, of economic inequality, anchored in the hierarchical segmentation of the production system, in the deepening chasm between the advanced and backward parts of production. That's the disappointment, and that it is crucial that we understand it. So I now propose to proceed in 3 steps. In the first step, to explore the causation of this disappointment. How are we to understand it causally? Our causal understanding will shape our response. Second, then, to focus on certain aspects of the programmatic response in the light of the causal understanding. And third, to make some remarks about the level of transformative ambition that is appropriate in our circumstance. So first, the causal account. Let me contrast 3 narratives about this disappointment. The first 2 are the most influential narratives today, and I want to argue against them. So the first we could call the narrative of automation. In simple terms, the idea is we have this technological dynamism, and it has run away from us. It has an intrinsic logic, which instead of complementing and augmenting labor, replaces labor. And so as it continues, more and more workers are rendered jobless or condemned to bad jobs, to to make work to insecure employment. And the best that we can do for them in this circumstance is to develop a series of social compensations, such as, for example, the minimum guaranteed income. Now, the first objection is to the diagnosis itself. On the one hand, it has never happened in modern economic history up to now that a major technological advance simply diminishes the aggregate level of employment. That's what the traditional economics calls the lump sum fallacy about employment. It destroys some jobs and creates others. So if this were to happen now, it would be happening for the first time. It never happened before. On the other hand, we know that technological evolution is always indeterminate in its social forms and therefore in its social and economic consequences. It is shaped. It doesn't have a single form. So it seems more plausible to think that the evolution in the direction of replacing labor or complementing and enhancing labor is open, and it depends on what we do. And the response that is suggested by this first narrative, the narrative of automation, has the defect of having no relation to the supply side of the economy, to the possibilities and future of production. And it doesn't give people what they most need and want, which are good jobs. Now comes the second narrative. The second narrative is the narrative of exhaustion. One part of this narrative is that the contemporary technologies are inherently less fertile in their potential than the technological innovations of 100 years ago. So it's as if we sometimes, it's said, are picking the low-hanging fruit. We're exhausting or running down the transformative possibilities of technological evolution. Now, this would be perplexing because, in principle, nothing could be more revolutionary than this combination of technologies: artificial intelligence, robotics, additive manufacturing or 3D printing, and computational biochemistry. They have a vast revolutionary potential, in principle, to change the whole situation of human life. So how are we to understand in that context this tremendous shortfall? The other part of this narrative of exhaustion, then, is in the light of this circumstance of diminishing rise in productivity, economic stagnation, the threat of joblessness or bad jobs, we repair to the toolbox of conventional Keynesianism: expansionary fiscal and monetary policy. Now, here too, there's a problem. It's like a shot in the dark. We expand demand, aggregate demand, but that has no organic connection to the evolution of production. Compared to the road building programs that took place in Germany in the 1930s or in the United States in the 1950s, they had a direct connection to the automobile industry, which was a central part of industrial mass production. Now we say we'll build airports or we'll build bridges to nowhere, but the fiscal stimulus has no proximate connection to a productivist project. Now then, here is a third narrative, and I wanted to call it the transformation narrative, by contrast to the automation narrative and the exhaustion narrative. The theoretical point of departure of the transformation narrative is that sustained and inclusive economic growth requires successive breakthroughs on both the supply side and the demand side of the economy. And there is no automatic correspondence ever between breakthroughs on the supply side and breakthroughs on the demand side. In retrospect, we can understand Keynes's theory of the slump of the Depression as a theory of a special case, a case focused on excessive hoarding, on the rigidity of wages, on a shortfall of demand, and not what the title of his book said it was, a general theory of slumps. Now, to understand the implications of this way of thinking for the explanation of our disappointment, let me consider the problem first from the supply side and then from the demand side of the economy. What would it take to change this circumstance? To understand the phenomenon is to understand how it could change. So on the supply side, there would have to be some way of reaching and lifting up the vast backward periphery of the production system. Declining mass production industry and the small retrograde businesses, large part of them isolated family businesses. Reaching them not just with credit, but with access to advanced practice, advanced technology, and markets. And I'm going to speak more to that in the second part of my remarks. But that wouldn't be enough. There'd have to be a second element in this supply side response to the disappointment. It's insufficient to reach firms. We also have to reach individuals. We're now in an economic situation in which an increasing part of the labor force is in conditions of insecure or precarious employment, including wage employment disguised as self-employment. And the middle part of the job structure has been hollowed out. That's a large part of the social and economic strategy. So we have to reach these individuals who are detached from large firms or large organizations. Now, what are examples of these people? So they are the nurse practitioner, or the technical repair person, or the IT support person in this middle part of the job structure. And we have to transform them into what you could call technologically equipped artisans. And that's the middle part of the job structure. And that requires coming to their aid, not just with continuous skilling, but with a series of forms of support that might require public-private partnerships or quasi-state organizations like the governmentally sponsored enterprises that the New Deal established in the housing market. And then from this middle part of the job structure, we would go both down and up. Down to the lower parts of the labor market, for example, janitorial workers or shelf stackers in supermarket and drugstore chains. And then up the ladder to the liberal professions, medicine, law, engineering, architecture. But the strategic place to begin would be the middle part of the job structure. Then the third element in this supply side transformation of the circumstance that results in the disappointment would be that we would prioritize all the forms of legal protection and empowerment that give workers access to the advanced part of production and power or economic returns within that advanced part. a sharing in the management and in the assets of the enterprises for which they work. We can't reconcile the reduction of the majority of the labor force to conditions of radical economic insecurity with a dynamic of inclusive rise in productivity. In the United States, there would be yet a fourth element, which is it would be necessary to refinance the American state. The aggregate tax take in the United States is at least 10% lower than the aggregate tax take in the European societies and all the advanced industrial countries, and it is incompatible with any program of reconstruction. So the aggregate tax take would have to be raised. Now, the only way to raise the aggregate tax take sufficiently in the short term is to rely, as the European social democracies have, primarily on the regressive and indirect taxation of consumption. And then what is lost by way of progressivity on the revenue-raising side of the budget is gained in double on the spending and investment side. Now, the American progressives don't accept that, and they prefer pietistic gestures to transformative effects. So they insist on progressive taxation. Progressive taxation doesn't resolve the central part of the tax take, and they disassociate the problem of the profile of the revenue-raising side from the problem of the profile of the spending side, which is the key to an understanding of comparative fiscal experience. Now let's go then to the demand side of the economy, because I said that the way we have to think is there have to be continuous and reciprocally reinforcing breakthroughs on the supply side and on the demand side of the economy. So there are two crucial distinctions that are pertinent to developing the way of thinking that we need. First, we have to prefer a distribution of assets to a democratization of credit. So one way to understand what happened in the United States in the late 20th and the early 21st centuries is that the aspiration to a property-owning democracy was replaced by a fake credit democracy, made possible in part by the overvaluation of the housing stock as collateral. And that was a large part of the background to the crisis of 2008. You cannot have a deep and sustained expansion of economic opportunity and advantage based on the popularization of credit, of debt, not backed up by a sharing of assets. And the second contrast that is crucial is the contrast between empowerment, legally shaped by the legal arrangements, especially the arrangements that protect labor and its relation to the firms, that cannot be replaced by compensatory redistribution, by tax and transfer, redistributive social spending, entitlements. They have a useful and indispensable role, especially for investment in people and their capabilities. But they don't replace economic empowerment. A share in power, a protection against economic insecurity, as well as a share in assets. It is that combination of moves on the supply and the demand side of the economy that would change the situation. And only movement in that direction, on this argument of the transformation narrative, can secure that result. Everything else will fail. Now I want to make a second set of remarks, focusing in on one aspect of what I just described as the supply side. And speaking to Danny's PowerPoint just now. So remember those initiatives that he described as the government, the importance of what the government does, its programs, its moonshots, intellectual property, incentives for research and development, and so forth. Now, what I want to say is that all of those things are useful in the needed transformation, the move from an insular to an inclusive knowledge economy, if there is the project of such a transformation. They can be enlisted in the service of that project. But all by themselves, that whole list, all of it, and many other things that we can add to it, do not automatically result in the needed transformation. So the project has to exist. And what are the crucial points of inflection in the project? So we can go on with business as usual, the path of least resistance, the form of the knowledge economy that least disturbs the ruling interest in established preconceptions, or we can break from that. And what determines whether we will go on with business as usual or break into this other direction? There are two crucial points of transformation on the supply side. One regards education, and the other regards access to the resources and opportunities of production, what Karl Marx called the means of production. So first, education. Unlike industrial mass production, this knowledge economy has very demanding educational requirements. It requires a particular form of education, both on the general side and on the technical side. It requires a form of general education that accords priority to the mastery of analytic and synthetic capabilities over the mastery of information. Because these capacities cannot be acquired in a vacuum of content, it demands that with respect to content, we prioritize depth over coverage, so thematic or project-oriented education. It demands that education have the characteristics of advanced scientific work in its social setting, which is to prefer cooperation to the juxtaposition of individualism and authoritarianism. And in its most ambitious form, it calls for an education that is dialectical. Everything should be taught at least twice from contrasting points of view. Nothing should be taught just once. And in a country like the United States, or my country, Brazil, that is large, unequal, and federal in structure, it requires a series of initiatives and arrangements that reconcile the local management of the schools by the states and towns with national standards of investment in quality. Quality of the education that a young person receives can't depend on the happenstance of where or to whom it was born. So, for example, a procedure for corrective intervention in a local failing school system. Take it over, assign it to independent administrators, fix it, return it fixed. And none of that can be done by a series of educational despots on the top. There has to be a national movement, thousands of schools and teachers who are involved in this project of national liberation. Now, so let's say that that's one crucial inflection point. The second crucial inflection point has to do with the access to the resources and opportunities of production. And let me schematically distinguish three stages. So the first stage, we begin modestly. And the focus is simply to broaden access to a much larger range of economic agents. access not just to credit, but also technology, advanced practice, and markets. And not just to firms, as I said, but also to individuals. That was the idea of the technologically equipped artisans in the middle part of the job structure. The other aspiration of this first stage is to have a procedure, a decentralized experimentalist procedure, a series of support centers intermediate between the government and the benefited firms or individuals to discover what works and to disseminate what works. We can't know what works a priori. Now then we can imagine a second stage in which we begin to develop a different institutional architecture of the market economy. There are now two models of government-business relations in the world. There's the American model of arm's length regulation of government by business, and the Northeast Asian model of formulation of unitary trade and industrial policy imposed top-down by the bureaucratic apparatus of the state. And we would need a third model, a form of collaboration between the government, national and local governments, and the firms or individual agents, to the end of disseminating the advanced practices that would be decentralized, pluralistic, participatory, and experimental. And then would come the third stage, much further in the future, in which we take the existing regimes of contract and property, codified in present private law, as only one subset of possible ways of organizing a decentralized economy. And we begin to experiment with many other forms, many other derivatives of the property right, so that different stakeholders, workers, local communities, and local governments, as well as investors, can hold stakes simultaneously in the same productive resources. And these different regimes of economic decentralization shaped by law would coexist experimentally in the same market order. Now I want to make my third and final set of remarks. All this is very ambitious, and then I'm going to be challenged once again by my friend here. He says, we can't even get up to here and you want us to get to there. So I want to make three remarks about the problem of transformative ambition. So first, the relation of structural change to fragmentary change. They're not opposites. This is a very high mountain to climb, but we don't climb it all at once. And we can climb it from different sides. It's not true that this is all just one system. What is true is that we advance on one side, on one front, we hit against a limit, and then we discover that we can only advance further there if we advance further on other fronts. That's how it is. And so it's crucial to be able to break up this large, intimidating task into steps. But what matters in a programmatic proposal is that it have these two attributes, that it mark a direction, and that in a particular circumstance, it select the initial steps by which to begin to move in that direction. Now, the second remark concerns the base, the constituency of such an alternative. It can't have as its constituency the core historical constituency of the left or progressive parties. The organized labor headquartered in the capital-intensive sectors of the production system, especially traditional industrial mass production. That's no longer the majority, and it doesn't speak for the majority. It is increasingly perceived and perceives itself as just one more special interest. And its leaders don't have the project of converting that form of production into something else that would have a future, the knowledge economy. So every powerful transformative project builds its own base over time. It doesn't find an antecedent base. And this base has to include 4 elements that have been historically opposed. The first are the workers in the traditional capital-intensive sectors of production. The second are the precarious employees in this vast periphery, this new putting out system that is emerging in the world and in every major economy. The third is the small business class. And the fourth is the rank and file of the professional business class itself, which is increasingly separated in the United States and in the European societies from the top plutocratic elite. It has good wages, good salaries, but its situation is worse and worse, not just in economic terms, but above all in experiential terms. It's increasingly condemned to drudgery and to powerlessness and available to some form of radicalization. And it is that constituency that has to be developed. And that is a work of statecraft and of imagination. Now, the third remark concerns the unifying theme of all of this. You wouldn't, for example, engage in a project for the radical transformation of education just because it's useful to the development of the economy. So each of the parts of this program have independent motivations and benefits, but there's something that unifies them. And what unifies them is an ideal of the enhancement of agency. And this is the animating conception, the vision, that we can become bigger only by becoming bigger together, and that we can become bigger together only by reimagining and remaking the institutional arrangements of the economy and the state.
Let me try to probe a little bit and see whether we agree or disagree, or how much we disagree. So there is a kind of habitual debate that we have that you refer to, which is that you object to many of the individual remedies that I provide as examples of moving in the direction of a more inclusive technological path, by saying, but this doesn't nearly begin to do justice to the range of.
Just one word there.
Yep.
So it's not that I object to them, and I tried to be careful about that. It's that whether they will produce the desired effect or not depends on what they're part of. And all by themselves, they don't add up to the necessary transformative project. But in the context of that project, they might be very useful or even indispensable.
Right, but so my question is whether that says a lot or that says a little. So the question is, I don't think there is, I think one of the points that you made is that the focus on individual, I'm just paraphrasing, but the focus on individual remedies has to be part of an overall project. And I couldn't agree more. I mean, we have to have a sense of direction. We have to have a sense of where we're heading. There is a mountain that we want to climb, and we have to have a sense of what that mountain is. So I don't think there is any disagreement there. So the question is whether, by the time I take your, I think it's 6-pronged agenda, 4 on the supply side and 2 on the demand side, and think about how I would make progress on this. I'm just, again, sort of, it seems like it evolves something to a set of remedies, albeit remedies that we are quite consciously deploying in the service of a particular project. Now, it seems to me that I mean, there's a kind of a rhetorical strategy you follow, which is that there is a tension between the kind of scale of transformation and the specificity actually with which you describe it on the one hand, and then you're emphasizing on the other hand the notion that there's a lot of experimentalism that's required because we don't, after all, know what is going to work. So there's, you know, that.
But that shouldn't be an excuse for making specific proposals.
It is not, but
the arrangements have to have this experimental character.
But my claim, I guess my claim is that if you take your experimentalism and your necessary degree of agnosticism on what is going to be work or not, that if you take that sufficiently seriously, that you're not going to end up anywhere particularly different from where I am. So the rhetorical strategy is the claim of a particular kind of radicalism in the service of, when push comes to shove, a rather kind of a technocratic agenda.
I disagree.
I put it that way because I know you'd hate it.
No, I disagree. So let's take first the most abstract form of the problem, and then I want to go to some of the particulars of the PowerPoint again. So the abstract form of the problem is this, and it is a unique problem that we have in our historical circumstance. I don't believe that it's a problem in my argument, except to the extent that the argument shares a problem of our historical predicament. The problem is this: we're discovering that structural alternatives have primacy over non-structural alternatives. No. So by structural, I mean institutional. The institutional arrangements of the economy and the state and the ideological assumptions associated with them. It's not enough simply to reallocate rights and resources. The abandonment of a structural agenda was the keynote of the social democratic settlement of the mid-20th century. So that became the horizon of contemporary politics. You don't change the order, you humanize it. And that's not enough, because all of the problems now are structural problems requiring structural solutions. Example, the one we're discussing, the hierarchical segmentation of the economy, the division between the advanced and backward parts. But unlike the liberals and socialists of the 19th century, we cannot believe in definitive, dogmatic institutional blueprints. So this was the characteristic of 19th century radicalism. Each faction of the liberals and the socialists had its formula: the system of liberal rights, the socialist substitute for capitalism, and so forth. And they peddled these formulas. We can't believe in that. So therefore, we have this predicament, which I'm claiming is unprecedented in the history of the modern West, which is to recognize the primacy of structural alternatives while resisting the succumbing to a structural dogmatism. That's us. No one has faced that before. And one way to deal with that, which you raise in relation to my argument, but I say it's a general problem of ours, is that one of the most important attributes of our institutions is that they lend themselves to correction in the light of experience. And I do try and insist on that in all of these particular proposals, that they organize their own transformation in the light of experience. And that also makes them resemble empirical science to a greater extent. Now, going back then to the PowerPoint, I would say
But let me interrupt you there for a second, because I want to just push you on this.
Yes.
So how do we know, for example, that if we have, that if we are really to be open to correction, how do we know that the right direction for the United States is that there has to be an increase in the tax stake, which you feel very strongly about. Maybe the
Because
answer is
none of
actually a
these other
reduction.
projects is compatible with an unfunded state. So
But there's
it's
a lot of-
not that it's just money, but there is some capital investment required. And this radical defunding of the American state is incompatible with that transformation.
Maybe we spend a lot less on defense. Maybe it's because we don't like compensatory transfers, so we move away from entitlements and we just do a redistribution of assets, which wouldn't necessarily cost the state a thing by just, if, for example, forcing corporations to redistribute shares to their workers.
But the state has to have, the part of the argument that regards the refinancing of the state is about the state's capacity for public investment in people, in these technologically equipped artisans, in the peripheral firms. The state has to have resources.
No, I agree with you there, but I'm
Yeah.
just saying that doesn't necessarily mean that the only way to accomplish that is to increase the tax stake, because there
Well,
are
if
many
other
different
parts
ways in which we can deploy
Could be
existing
radically
resources.
diminished. I don't.
Or,
I'm
for
not
example,
sure.
or that you just take for. I mean, let me move to a somewhat another question, but in relation to this, which I think is important as to whether we are in a singularly different moment in history. You emphasized a lot on education, the role of education as a way that we can actually empower individuals to have much greater access and co-develop these technologies.
If connected to change on the supply side.
Together with
Because
changes
all
on
by
the supply
itself,
side.
it means very little.
Exactly. So, historically, the relationship between education and technology has been that as much as we've made strides in education, technology has also developed quite rapidly. And so in some sense, that the gap between the ability of a vast majority of the labor force to actually use existing technology has always remained within a certain kind of a distance, so that investment in tech, so there's a kind of a race between how fast we can empower individuals through education and how rapidly technology develops. Now, is it your contention that either because of today's technological characteristics or because of the kind of structural alternatives you've discussed, that we can actually overcome that race, that we can...
The race
Between how quickly we can empower individuals to essentially become, all of them, knowledge workers. And the development of the technologies which might require skills that are becoming increasingly more refined and more specialized.
But why is that a race? Those are complementary, right?
To the extent that these new technologies are going to require skills and qualities and abilities.
To evolve in a way in which is labor augmenting and enhancing rather than labor substituting.
Well, I'm not looking at that dimension of labor replacing versus labor augmenting.
Yes.
I'm looking at the degree to which being able to participate in the economy as a
Sure.
as a creative user and a creative
Yes.
contributor to the knowledge economy
Yes.
makes demands on skills.
Absolutely.
You said these demands
Absolutely.
are
And
very...
yes, I'm afraid of the label knowledge worker because it makes it sound too elite. And it's good to think of the implication of this for technical education, for vocational training. So the most influential model of technical education in the world is the old German model, which is focuses on job-specific and machine-specific skills. So there are 6 types of lathes that are the metal cutting lathes that were central to conventional industry. So you master them, you have these different professions. To deal with numerically controlled machine tools, we have higher order skills. because the machines themselves can be adjusted. In 3D printing, for example, is the rapid back and forth between conception and materialization. And that's not like that requires skills that are very different in nature from the skills of this traditional model of vocational training. Now, that has an additional benefit which transcends the economic order, because as Democrats, we wouldn't want the traditional European contrast between general education for the elites and technical education for the masses. We want a continuum. And when general education and technical education are both transformed in the direction that I described, then they are on a continuum. And they're not radically different. They have the same spirit and analogous methods. And they serve the economy, this advanced practice of production, but they also have a vast set of other benefits. They're necessary to a high-energy democracy. They liberate the individual. They are a basis for this enhancement of agency, which is the unifying ideal of this whole project. And that's how I would think of it. But I do want to say, because I'm not sure we disagree about this with respect to your PowerPoint, that if I look at each of the elements of the PowerPoint, R&D, intellectual property, the government projects, I'm just struck by how useful they would be if they were part of such a project, but how insufficient they would be if all we had was that list. And so we can't infer the necessary project from that list or by simply adding to the list, but the list is nevertheless immensely useful if we appropriate it in the context of such a project.
And the requirement for those to be part of that project is what exactly, besides saying that they're part of the project?
That with respect to the second part, when, in my second set of remarks about focusing on the educational change and on the change on the institutional architecture of the market economy, that they be used to move in that direction. So that we have, for example, that we're concerned to create and equip this cadre of technologically enhanced artisans in the middle part of the job structure. We're concerned to take part of the periphery of retrograde small and medium-sized businesses and bring them up closer to the vanguard. And then we use those devices that you listed for that purpose. And we do it together with this educational change. Now that, to me, makes them incomparably more promising. But the mere deployment of the list would not, in and of itself, bring about this inflection. That's the argument that I'm making.
Okay, so I mean, let me just run through. I mean, I think just for the benefit of everybody, and just I think some of the key ideas on the supply side that you raised. First, lifting the mass of retrograde industries businesses that are currently cut off from the frontier.
By analogy to agricultural
practices.
extension in the first stage.
That's right. Second, beyond that, reaching to individuals in terms of being able to equip them in a way that they can access existing and new technologies. Third, prioritizing legal reforms or legal institutions.
The protection and empowerment of precarious labor rendered under conditions of decentralized contractual arrangements. And that requires, if you'd allow me, Danny, just a little gloss. So we think of the normal form of labor as assembly of a stable labor force in large productive units like factories under the aegis of big corporations. In the West, that was preceded by several centuries of what Karl Marx in the early chapters of Capital described as the putting out system, which the workers work apart, the capitalist provides material or machines. They're a series of decentralized contractual arrangements. They're not internalized in the firm. Now we see emerging in the world on a global scale a new putting out system. And what we think of as the natural form of the organization of labor may in retrospect turn out to be a relatively brief interlude from the middle of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th of these two putting out systems. And now it is then crucial for this project of inclusive rise in productivity that this putting out system not serve as the occasion for the surrender of the majority of the labor force to radical economic insecurity. That's incompatible with this rise in inclusive productivity. So there are two mistakes we can make. And these two mistakes are expressed in the two dominant discourses about labor in the world. One mistake is to say we can abolish these new relations of production by decree. We can make them illegal. And then we're trying to suppress by law a fundamental change in the practice of production. The other mistake is to accept the change, but under its neoliberal interpretation, which is to use the category of flexibility as the euphemism for then consigning the majority of the labor force to radical insecurity. So we have to reject those two mistakes, and we have to create a new body of rules that governs this new economic reality, organizes, represents, and protects these workers to the extent that they're not organized and protected, direct legal intervention in the employment relation. For example, by a principle of price neutrality, so that the labor given under conditions of temporary or precarious employment must be remunerated at a level comparable to the analogous labor given under stable employment. That's an example. So, and this requires the invention of a new form of law. Now, isn't it a mystery that the progressives in the world don't even propose that? It's not part of the debate.
Well, I mean, that's what I mean. Part of my point in running through this list was to suggest that is not so.
Yes.
But to complete the list, the fourth item on that supply side list was, and I'll put it somewhat a little bit differently in light of our exchange just now, is ensuring that the state has adequate resources to finance public investment.
Yes, and that has to be based on an understanding, which is something that this is a very important point. On paper, if you take the North Atlantic countries, on paper, the American tax system is the most progressive because it's the most heavily dependent on the progressive taxation of personal income.
You're discussing the means. That's why I stated it the way that I did, which is that is what your objective here is to ensure that the state has adequate resources to finance public investment. The means, whether it's done through progressivity, you don't have much progressivity on the tax side, but it's the spending side. I mean, those are technical issues. I don't know why
I don't think they're because I think they're not technical.
Because you're trying to argue against somebody who's not present.
No, but I'm trying to argue against the zeitgeist, against the dominant view.
Well, zeitgeist has changed. Everybody agrees that the U.S. should have more public investment.
No, but no. There is the debate. The conventional debate is the conservatives want price-neutral taxation with a low tax take. The progressives want a higher tax take with progressive taxation.
To be able to finance more spending.
Yeah, but they can't get the higher tax take that way. It's a misunderstanding because they're looking at the budget in a one-sided way. They're looking at the revenue-raising side separately from the spending side.
Well, I think the people who are the most vocal advocates of increasing the progressivity of the U.S. tax system and of wealth taxes would not necessarily disagree with what you're saying, but that they would say that more progressive wealth taxes or more progressive income taxes
They're independently good.
Would be part of
Yes.
any scheme to increase the
Yes.
overall ability of the state to engage in spending for desirable purposes. But I just want to say one final thing, and we should have some discussion
Yes.
with the class, and that is to say that, I mean, there's a way that I could have put each one of your 4 points that would actually relate it to much more to actual ongoing discussions in policy circles, whether progressive or not. That is that the first item is really a kind of an extended discussion now today about industrial policy, the ability of the state now to engage with subnational level or to federal level with producers to create much wider set of productive clusters around the world, going around the country,
Yes.
going beyond the few that exist. This is now very much a mainstream kind of a topic. The interventions with respect to equipping individuals and workers is very much a discussion about workforce development, skills training, huge area. I know that's not exactly how you would put it, but it relates, and there's a certain amount of overlap. The discussion on sort of these legal protections to ensure that workers do not leave precarious economic lives in the context of these new arrangements there's a very live discussion about sort of what that legal legal reforms there ought to be. Again,
Yes.
it's fairly mainstream. I just don't think it's true that these progressives aren't thinking about such issues. And then we discuss the public finance
Yes.
side.
And there's a particular point of departure in the present experience, which is the pedagogy of disappointment, of disillusionment. So a primitive idea, widespread in the United States and in the world, is everyone wants their own Silicon Valley. So different European countries, why don't we have our Silicon Valley? The governors of the American states, then they create these industrial parks, heavily subsidized. It doesn't work. And it's never worked. And that failure then creates an opening for the discussion. I don't want that moment of opportunity to be filled up by the list. And that's then the point
Okay.
at which we began our discussion.
But I guess part of what I'm saying is that you were radical once because people weren't onto these things, but you're a lot less radical today because people have caught up. So, and you should just enjoy that. That's a
No,
good
it's that
thing.
they've become radical.
Exactly.
They're being radicalized.
So,
I said that even the professional business class is being radicalized.
That is, I think that is true. So let's take some questions, preferably people who have not spoken before that I can remember. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is mainly for you, Danny. You said that in response, because you were trying to isolate this idea of why we need to work with this middle class in order to be so transformative with this list. Do you really think that the vanguard, which has so much control over the current dispersal or diffusion, as Professor Unger put it, of technological capabilities, is actually willing to work with this economic model that would redistribute or regressively appropriate wealth throughout the economy? Because it seems to me that we have to create legislation that accounts for that. Because the progressive idea that they're going to, even though people say they want it to happen, it does not seem realistic right now with our current political economy.
So I think there's two things. One is that and in relation to my slide, so there's a question of to what extent it might be in the self-interest of firms to engage in certain practices that would be in line with this agenda because it's actually beneficial to them. So let's not discount entirely that possibility. And the reason I take that as a real possibility is because there's a huge movement on the part of certainly larger firms with respect to started out corporate social responsibility, economic, social, environmental criteria, with respect to stakeholder firms. Sort of the corporate sector essentially is now in the process of moving away from a model of governance which views the whole purpose of the firm to be to maximize shareholder value and saying that this is actually not necessarily a legal requirement, that we could actually have a much broader set of objectives. I think that's because they're reacting to the existing political moment, that we are in a moment of flux, and they understand that firms and corporations understand that they are the biggest beneficiaries of the system as it exists, and therefore they have a stake in its continuation, but the status quo ante cannot continue, so they have to increase the circle of winners, so to speak. But that's the first part, which is that we can capitalize on that. And I think often firms are willing to tell governments that you tell us what we ought to do, because we're not necessarily the best judge how to help our local communities. So there might be in many cases, much more willing to abide by a regulatory model or a kind of a cooperative model where they're part of a kind of an effort where local public agencies are much more involved, because they shouldn't be necessarily the ones who are defining what that agenda is in the first place. But the second aspect of it is that we can't rely on only on enlightened self-interest. And I think the kinds of broader legal and institutional changes that would enforce effectively a quid pro quo, which is to say that you have a much bigger role to invest in your communities, think about the external effects of your technology choices and all of that, in return for existing as privileged actors in the society, which is, after all, your legal form. The corporation is one that's provided by the state to you. So you benefit from that, but in return you have an obligation, and here are what those obligations are. I think much more explicit enforcement of that quid pro quo through these legal reforms, whether it's in the area of labor relations or it's in corporate governance law, it's about competition law, it's on the area of innovation, regulations, and direction. So I think that will have to be also part of this. So I think short answer to your question is there is enough there in enlightened self-interest to be the foundation of movement in that direction. But I think what seems to be lacking to enact the second part of the program is what Roberto says, which is the lack of a very explicit project on the part of national governments or the politicians to say that this is the vision, this is where we want to go. And we might start slow, we might want to do it in steps, but this is the broader project. It was all the way in the back.
So this is speaking exactly to that and to the lack of the broader view. As you brought up, the four categories that you discussed are already in the progressive space, but there does still seem to be a gap between the conversation happening within the progressive parties and the range of the policies that seem to be required to combat this. So instead of taking that gap as given, I was wondering if you could speak to what you see as shaping the reasons for that gap. So, why is it that the ideas have not caught up? Is it a ideas and interest thing? Is it sort of a political possibility thing? What do you think are the reasons for that?
I'll let Roberto say something about that too. But to me, I think it's quite remarkable the range of these ideas that have already become mainstream. So I think these things take a bit of time. But frankly, 4 years ago, you told me that that wealth taxes have become. I know that Roberto doesn't like that, but think about it as radical an idea as you can think of in the context of U.S. Public discussion 4 years ago. And it's hard to find more than something more like that than wealth tax. But it's become almost mainstream in the political discussion. Industrial policy now is both a kind of on the progressive agenda and on the conservative agenda. I think I think we are moving in that direction. So I see less of a gap than I would have seen 4 years ago, when I think many of these trends were already there, but the political narratives and what the political class was talking about seemed so far away from these kinds of issues. So I'm much more optimistic. But
well, to flip that, then, what do you think has driven that? Right, the mainstream. Right, is it the response to populism? Is it because you could write a model that does that? You've got some, but I was wondering what you see as driving that.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, you're pushing me further and further away from my expertise, which is to try to make me comment on American politics. So I'll let Roberto do that.
So it's interesting, this situation that Danny describes. So Danny says that at the micro level, the theoreticians, the economists, the policy people are coming closer to this idea. That's not clear to me. I'm not convinced of that yet. They're coming close to it in little pieces, like this idea of industrial policy. But in their minds, does that add up to the conception of a different direction? Well, and I thought that was part of your question. So look around you at the debate that's now happening in the United States. The dominant model of the American progressives remains the New Deal. And they sentimentalize the New Deal. The New Deal had an early moment of institutional experimentalism, which was actually dominated by corporatist restabilization of the economy, not by the democratization of the economy. Then it narrowed its focus to the provision of antidotes to economic insecurity, as in the Social Security program. And then, after the war, the country turned to the popularization of consumption, to the demand side. In this trajectory, in the realm of political economy, I think it's fair to say that on the whole, the American progressives and the European progressives continue to have no productivist project. Their whole emphasis is on the consumption and demand side of the economy, rather than the production and the supply side of the economy. And so they abandon the supply side to the conservatives, and that is a proxy for a more general problem in the organization of contemporary politics. The cause of energy, of innovation, of restlessness is represented by the right. And then the left says, what's our project? Our project is your project with a human face. Well, that's a losing position in politics. The force that commands the agenda is the force that most credibly embodies the cause of energy, of construction, of innovation, the creation of the new. And then the issue is whether it should have an inclusive form or not. But I don't see that as having happened yet in the shape of the larger political discussion in the United States or in Europe.
I think there's a lot more focus on the supply side than you make it out. I mean, I mean, the focus on the focus on the productivist agenda, that was really completely absent until a few years ago. But I think even that now is coming in through a variety of different forms. I mean, I think, you know, the reform of labor market, labor law, corporate governance, competition policy, and antitrust is, you know, very much part of this discussion now. Industrial policy, as I said, has come in. That's certainly on the productivist. I think we can discuss some of these elements and how they add up.
Fit together.
I think you're right that it's still, you know, New Deal is still the kind of you know, the idealized. But I think there has been a lot of change. So I don't know if we have maybe time for
so much the better. So much the better.
I agree. So there's maybe time for one more, Earth?
You conclude that the current innovation supporting policy are needed in the process of transformation to inclusive web.
I'm not sure if everybody can hear you. Can you speak up? I'm sorry.
You conclude that all the current innovation supporting policy are needed in the process of transformation to inclusive vector. But I doubt that this is true because some policy, for example, the policy that the government give funding to certain companies might perpetuate inequality of the vector rather than promote inclusive vector. So I'm not sure whether the claim that all of the current policy are needed in the process of transformation is true. I doubt what is your take.
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll talk a lot more about that in the context of some of our industrial policy discussions later in the term. But I think what I would say is that I was advocating not the continuation of the existing funding model or existing innovation support policies of the federal government, as much as I was supporting that at least a parallel set of activities that were based much more on this sort of model of dissemination and creation of good jobs. So that would be part of the explicit quid pro quo for innovation support. And to that extent, if you do want the vanguard to be part of this, because that's where the technologies and the capabilities are, but that would be, unlike the existing system, would be one that would be based much more on generating these benefits of dissemination, of inclusion, creation of more and better and good jobs for others as well. But we'll talk a lot more, I think, about that later as well. So, final word?
Final word is I was so happy to hear that I'm not alone.
You're not. Look at everyone here. Okay, see you next week.